I'm going to redo this video because I'm going to just take off some of the examples and we'll do those as individual exercises. I want to introduce the idea of EQ and kind of talk through the detail of the facts about it. It really is kind of a lecture, but this is very important information in my opinion, and I think most people would agree with me. So what is EQ? I like to think of it as a process. We EQ almost everything. We EQ, the kick drum, snare drum, bass, guitars, vocals. And what we're doing when we EQ is kind of sculpting. We are cutting little bits and pieces off of sounds that we don't like. We're boosting parts of those sounds that we like. And we use it to essentially accentuate the things we want to hear and cut the things that we don't. I think this comes up later again, but the main elements or the main parameters of EQ are amplitude and frequency. Amplitude is measured in decibels and frequency is measured in hertz. I'm going through this because I think that comes up again. If you want to look at EQ as graphically, it is an XY axis. The x-axis is frequency and the y-axis is plus or minus amplitude. Because you can boost frequencies and you can cut frequencies, additive EQ and subtractive EQ. This is not representative of the range. Human hearing actually goes from 20, supposedly, depends also on what, at least in music production and production in general, depends what your speakers can recreate. I know you're not going to be hearing 20 to 20 with headphones. But human hearing supposedly goes from 20 hertz up to 20 kilohertz or 20,000 hertz. As you age, the top end especially starts to come down. Let's look at a quick image. So this is an EQ. What's cool about this one is that it shows you the waveforms as it's kind of coming into the unit, and as you cut or add things, you see that the waveform changes. You have your y-axis, you have your x-axis of frequency. This is the snare drum. I think it's just important to show that the snare drum does not have a whole lot of frequency energy below 200 and not much above 5,000 or 5K. Okay, so that's kind of something that comes up that I like to talk about, I should say, when I get to the fundamental here. Okay, so as we define frequency, that is the number of vibrations of a wave per second. So you can see this image here that a higher frequency is going to have more vibrations and a lower frequency are going to have longer waves and longer waves and therefore fewer vibrations. Every sound source is going to cover a range of frequencies, just like I showed you here. That snare drum is covering, it does have some energy down at 20, and it has some energy up around 15. But it really doesn't have much in those extremes of the lows and the highs. A bass is going to have a different range. A kick drum is going to have a different range. Instead of fundamental, I think of it sometimes as kind of the sweet spot. What is the sweet spot for that instrument? And we do want to carve out the parts that we don't want. Because if you start to think about this, if we look at the kick drum has much more energy in those low frequencies and much, much less in the highs and mids. So we want to allow the snare drum to have its space, to own its space, and the kick drum to own its space. And if there's too much that's overlapping, they can mask each other and kind of create a not so pleasant sound. You get more mud, a lack of clarity. If you want to think of frequency and pitch, the relationship, or compare, it is really important that essentially pitch and frequency are the same thing. We usually tend to think of pitch as musical tone, but it is determined by the frequency of vibrations. The higher the frequency, the higher the note, the higher the pitch. For example, if you are tuning a guitar, an open A string is 440 hertz. That is A4. So that's above middle C. So again, the parameters of EQ, there are three main parameters that we want to think about. Amplitude, how the loudness of a particular frequency. It is measured in decibels. And again, it is the amplitude in a frequency range that we may cut or add to. I guess I could have just used this. So amplitude, y-axis, frequency, x-axis from 20 to 20. And then the third one is bandwidth, essentially how much of the surrounding frequencies are you affecting when you aim for your center fundamental. And I'll show you that here. So I'll come to the center here, and I'm just going to click and drag. What's kind of cool about this EQ is that it has no fixed bandwidths. You can kind of create your own. And that's definitely much more complicated to start with. This one, for example, only has 5 across from lows to highs, and then 2 filters. But the same idea. I can bring up this. My fundamental frequency is 868, right in the mids. But my Q, or my bandwidth, and again, bandwidth and Q are the same thing, but it doesn't say bandwidth, it says Q. I can narrow it and be very surgical with what I'm trying to do, or I can just be very broad. However, something like this doesn't make much sense because not only am I bringing up 850 hertz, I'm also bringing up 200. I'm also bringing up 100. I'm bringing up some 6,000. So that's just kind of not really a thing. Okay. So if I bring here, I can come over to my Q. I can raise it or lower it. I can increase the gain here and cut or add. And those are the main parameters. So again, before we get into actually doing stuff with EQ, the last thing I want to say, I think I've said it. Instead of thinking about when to EQ, it is when do you want to accentuate, when do you want to add focus to a set of frequencies versus cut or be subtractive. And we use additive EQ when we want to accentuate something that we like in a sound. Let's just say the undersnare that has those wires underneath it. If we wanted to accentuate those wires, we would aim for a higher frequency and we would add to that frequency. If we don't like those wires, we might go to the same frequency range, but we would cut it. We EQ almost everything. The challenge is to identify the sweet spot, the fundamental of those sounds, and to kind of carve out as best you can the puzzle piece that is each instrument and have it sit in the mix so that it has space to express itself clearly and to the best of its sonic ability. It takes a long time to learn how to EQ, and it takes some practice, and it's okay. It's all right to experiment. I will probably tell you, I don't think that raising 100 hertz on a snare drum is a good idea. If let's say you add 10 dB of 100 hertz with a very wide Q, I'm going to tell you, I don't think that's a great idea. It's not what most people would do. But go ahead, you should experiment.